Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the gracious, the dispenser of grace. I was just wondering, do I go through all the usual stuff? I'm delighted to be here, I'm honored to be here, it's a pleasure for me to be here, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. Gloriously sleep. How glorious is. Okay, don't embarrass anybody now. I was, of course, listening to some of the earlier presentations and reflecting on the various uses of the words that are in vogue. Decoloniality, critical Muslim studies, liberation theology, and the interfaces between all of them. And I was struggling to say something different. I gave a talk the other day, a 50-minute talk, or 1-hour talk on Islamic Liberation Theology. Many of the same people are sitting in front of me today, so I can't possibly be going around and saying the same things that I said there. One of the questions that Muslims often have in naming different forms of theology is an adherence to a kind of essentialism that Islam is. And we don't need any kind of adjectives. And part of the adjectivizing of Islam is, in fact, to fragment the unity of Muslims, the unity of Islam. And so why are you doing this? Why do you have to speak about a moderate Muslim or a progressive Muslim or a liberationist Islam or Islam is Islam? Now, scientifically, theologically, in your religious imagination, that may well be true. But scientifically, it is just not the case. I mean, in the earliest forms of Islam already, there were tendencies, and whether these were legal tendencies or creedal tendencies dealing with theology, whether it was you started speaking about Ash'arite ideas or Maturidite ideas, or later on the more sectarian, whether it was Mu'tazila, the Mu'tazila is also an ideological and theological tendency, or later the more sectarian ones of Shiite and Sunnite, or the legal ones of the Hanbalites and the Malikites or the Shafi'ites. So various tendencies had already emerged very early on in Islam. And then depending on whether you want to look at things theologically or sociologically, the Santri and the Abang in the case of Indonesian Islam, or in the anthropological sense of the word, where you speak about high forms of Islam and low forms of Islam. Scientifically, I mean, there had always been various ways of describing the practice of Islam as well as doctrinal creeds. And so there is nothing new about this. But one also senses the a common Muslim aversion to not, a Muslim sense that Islam is like one, and there is a singular interpretation of Islam. And inside that is both a source of consolation for the believers in a very unstable world, for you to imagine that my source of religion or my anchor is really a solid anchor that I can put my complete faith into. And then people come along and say that, well, it's not really the case. I mean, there are very many different forms of this anchor that you believe is particularly solid. And people start talking about Islams. Ramon used the expression liberation. So not only do people speak about Islams, but liberation theologies. So there is this problem about, do you embrace and actually name? The reality is there about the diversity of the expressions of Islam, but the naming of it, I think, is often a serious problem for Muslims. It's connected, I think, to the essentialization of Islam, to the whole idea that there can possibly be only one way of interpreting the faith. Let me briefly clarify how I use the term. And I want to talk about the impulses behind liberation theology, the process of liberation theology, and then its objectives as my way of clarifying how I use the term. Now, religion, whatever the believers may imagine it to be, believers may be, and when I say imagine, I don't mean it is real. It is real or it is not real. It may be real, however believers may approach it. The reality is this, that religion over the years becomes transformed, defines different ways of expressing itself in different communities, amongst different classes, whether it is rural or urban, whether it is how it is expressed in, say, South Africa, from Indonesia and so on, and you always find variations of how this faith is expressed. And sometimes the changes that occurs in the expressions of religiosity, sometimes these changes occur simply in response to geographical or demographic requirements. When you are living in Iceland, for example, to put a very crude example, when you're living in Iceland, challenges do arise about how do you fast when the sun never sets. When you are living in a country where, in say, the niqab is banned, and for you it may be an important and essential part of your Islam, there are challenges in how you are going to be dealing with this now. And so religion, whether you like it or not, transforms. This is a sociological reality that is inescapable. So Islam, at one level, transforms all the time. But at another level, Islam also transforms in response to demands and in response to serious, concerted attempts, projects, wherein millions, billions are invested in terms of producing a particular kind of Islam. So Islam doesn't just transform on its own. Islam is also consciously being engineered. And so the question is, and I'll come back to this, the question then is, in response to which impulses does Islam reinvent itself? Does it reinvent itself in response to the demands and urgencies of the powerful? Or does it reinvent itself in response to the demands of the margins? For example, I was based in the United States for about 8 years, teaching there shortly after September the 11th. And as a theologian, all of the questions that I was continuously confronted with and being paid to answer at universities were questions relating to the demands of a wounded empire. So the empire was badly wounded after its own adventurisms in the world, and then being wounded, their demand was to be comforted. And so I was then paid to produce lectures and to deliver on Islam as peace. Talk to us about Islam as non-violence. Talk to us about Islam as moderation. Talk to us about Islam and, oh, we heard that you guys are like pretty bad in your relationship with women. So talk to us about Islam and gender. Talk to us about Islam and, well, I was never asked to, but I can well imagine, about Islam and homosexuality. So in various degrees, these were the demands of that society. And to the extent that gender and homosexuality were barometers now or presented as barometers of your civilizational value, those became key elements in the discourse of this new moderate, progressive, or liberal Islam. But above all, you had to speak about moderate Islam, and you had to speak about Islam and non-violence, Islam and peace. And this led to kind of a very, where many Muslims would come along and say, no, in order to assuage the wounds of the empire, that no, Islam is really, identical to American values. Islam, we have a lot of common, you know. In fact, properly understood, the message of the Quran is exactly the same as the values of the American Constitution. So on the one hand, there was this demand that Islam must be tailored to fit in with to assuage and comfort the wounds of the empire, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was the desperation of Muslims to do this in order that their own location inside the empire may not be destabilized, because they had sought refuge for different reasons, economic reasons, or whatever reasons. They had sought refuge in I'm talking about mostly what is called the expatriate Muslim community in the global north, and so they had now found comfort inside here. And so then Islam was now perceived as troublesome, and a new Islam had to be there were traces of this inside the Islamic reform tradition from Jamaluddin Afghani and Abdu and so on long before that, but the impulse to reform Islam became now particularly energized after lots of money, millions of rands was thrown into this. One example of this is the Islamic prohibition on interest, the Islamic prohibition on usury. The Quran, as far as I can understand it, is quite explicit about the prohibition on making money on money. You can make money on the sales of goods, but you can't make money off on the trading of money. And so Harvard University, for example, received $35 million to launch a project on Islamic finance. And Islamic finance today basically means the incorporation of interest into or making it acceptable to the Muslim imagination. And so when the needs of the powerful demand it, billions get invested in order to reshape Islam. So the first impulse of liberation theology is not the demands, neither the hunger nor the urgency of the powerful, but the search for and the location of yourself amongst the marginalized. And so this then leads to process. The process of liberation theology is one of locating yourself or your own intellectual work and your own activists on the margins of society. And the margins of society may differ from place to place, and there is enormous prophetic, or in terms of prophetic both in the sense in which it is used in religion studies, as well as in the sense it is used in Islamic studies as relating to the prophet, or prophetic as in speaking the truth to power. There is enormous resources in the Islamic tradition that privileges the interest of the marginalized, of the impoverished, of the enslaved, above the interest of others. But the important thing to note is that the location of liberation theology, and this is why there is an anomaly, I think, between the location of liberation theology and the idea of critical Muslim studies. The idea of critical Muslim studies is located in the world of the academy. It's critical Muslim studies. It happens in universities. The location of liberation theology, it is an anomaly. It is a contradiction for liberation theology to be located inside the academy. It is located in the struggles of ordinary people for different forms of liberation and from different forms of oppression. Liberation theology is, it happens post hoc. Your theorizing of liberation, it happens after your engagement inside a struggle. If I can just quickly narrate a personal example of this. My first major book that I wrote was called Quran, Liberation and Pluralism. And it was a reflection on some of the difficult questions that emerged inside the South African liberation struggle on the question of working with non-Muslims. And how do you deal with all these Quranic texts that says you should not work with Muslims? And in the midst of this crucible, the struggle against apartheid, there was inevitable interreligious solidarity of people against apartheid. But there were these texts that we had to grapple with. During the struggle, there were times when I was on the run. I couldn't surface in public because, the police were all over looking for me. And during those quiet times, I started reflecting on that. When the struggle kind of only formally came to an end, the unbanning of the ANC, the release of Nelson Mandela and so on, then I had time to reflect theologically on all of this and how now did those Quranic texts speak to us in the middle of this crucible, this struggle against apartheid. And then this work was produced, which arguably is the seminal text on Islamic Liberation Theology. Then I started thinking about other forms of marginality that I was encountering. I was hearing these stories about people who are infected with a sexually transmitted disease, HIV. And I was curious, what does Islam have to say about sexually transmitted diseases? So I started working with two research assistants of mine. Let's explore the question about Islam and sexually transmitted diseases, okay? But let's also figure out and find some people who are living with this. And then after a while, we realized that, wait, man, you don't write about sexually transmitted diseases in Islam without actually working with and encountering real people who had been ostracized and marginalized by their communities and who are living on the edges of societies. I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with a body that had died of AIDS, but it's literally just flesh and bones, nothing more to it. And sometimes these people had been so ostracized that their families had completely rejected them, and they ended up in Christian homes or hospices. And the family gets contacted when the body is dead and the body had already been cremated, and here a Muslim family gets handed a box of ashes. What do I do with this box of ashes? Can you imagine? And the family sometimes, I'm sorry, I can't take this. I don't know what to do with it. And the families walked away. So now, do you first get engaged in the issues of stigmatization, in the issues of life and death, the issues of marginalization of these people, and work with people, empower them, find different ways of relating to their isolation on the margin, and then you reflect on it, or do you now start writing a book before that? Now, the problem with theory, with much of theory in critical Muslim studies, is that it is theory, and it is dislocated from the ordinary struggles of the believers. And so in some ways there is a major problem about a liberation theology that is also located in the academy and that is primarily connected to the idea of studies, including the idea of critical Muslim studies. Let me use an analogy, and I'll try to run through it, of the challenge, I think, that faces a Muslim liberation theology in the world today, particularly after September the 11th. Some water, please. Thank you. And this is a bit of a news story. I've been telling a number of stories in the last few days. This is a bit of a news story for most of you, at least. I look at the challenge of an Islamic liberation theology, and I use the analogy of a restaurant. So here is this here is an Indonesian restaurant, and the restaurant specializes in Indonesian cuisine. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Indonesian cuisine, but there are a few kind of staples inside Indonesian cuisine. For example, peanut butter, peanut and coconut. These are some of the staples inside Indonesian cuisine. Indonesian cuisine generally doesn't deal with hamburgers. They don't deal with hamburgers. They don't deal with the ordinary kind of fast food that you get in your McDonald's. So on one fine day, on one fine day, a couple of clearly well-heeled men walk into this restaurant. They look powerful, they look strong, and their wallets look fat. And without much politeness, they ask you for, each of them want a double Whopper hamburger. Is this what Whoppers are called? Yes. Each one of them want a double Whopper. And then somebody rushes, the waiter smiles, yes, and the waiter rushes off to the back, tells the manager that this is what these people want, and the manager first, what the hell, I mean, this is, I've heard about it, I've eaten it a couple of times, but this is not exactly what our restaurant is about. But what do I do? The restaurant may be having, sometimes it's survival questions, but sometimes, here is my chance to make a big break. If I get these guys' order, and if they start becoming regulars in my shop, then I can tweak my cuisine in order to accommodate them. And so off he goes, he tweaks his cuisine to modify stuff in the kitchen and so on. And then the guys demand more and more tweaking of the cuisine. And then in the end, the restaurant becomes just a very mild version, perhaps some peanut sauce sprinkled over it and so on. But it is just another, McDonald's say in China. It's largely American food, but the design of the McDonald's store may be different and a bit of an item or two here on the menu, but nothing has substantially changed. It is what the American appetite demands. So then a question arises about what kind of restaurant is this after a while? It still has claims to be, and in order to appeal to the mystique of Indonesian cuisine, to the Oriental, to the Occidental imagination, you have to continue phrasing this as Indonesian cuisine, because there is something exotic about this. And then after a while, the same guys come in, and now they're demanding, say, they want pasta, different kinds of pastas on the menu. And then the entire operation in the restaurant has to change again to fit the demands of these people. And so for many, many years in the world of Islam, I'm just using one example, in our classical studies, we've studied a range of books in our traditional institutions. I'm a product of one of these Diyar al-Ulum, one of these Dar al-Ulum's religious institutions. I spent 8 years in them in Pakistan. So we have a classical Islamic course that we follow, okay? And one of the elements in there is, in our legal books, is Kitab al-Jihad, the book on jihad, okay? And we go through it in the same way that people in the yeshivas, in the Orthodox yeshivas, they study all these texts and so on. And the texts in some ways are alive, but they are alive as part of a tradition. And then certain political impulses are required to energize parts of the tradition and to bury other parts of the tradition. So after 79, they come into the Muslim world. Afghanistan is invaded. The Taliban are emerging. And with the emergence of the Taliban, you see now the possibilities of the defeat of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War and the emergence of a single dominant power in the world. Okay. So a fusion of Pathan, Afghani, fierce independence that had seen Afghanistan early on becoming a grave for the British colonialists and for several other colonial adventures. This is now invoked. Pashtun, resistance, rebellion, strength, images of macho, of the male, and defending us against the outsiders and so on. This is now fused with a certain kind of Islam. An Islam that now has all these texts on jihad, But for many years, the text on jihad had acquired another kind of meaning. The Tablighi Jamaat, for example, uses all the Quranic texts on jihad and hadith on jihad. And for years, for nearly 100 years now, they've been using it in a completely non-violent application of it. So these texts on jihad become energized. And a jihadi Islam is now infused with billions of dollars, mostly financed by the Saudis, armed by the United States and other European governments, and these people get trained. They go off to Afghanistan, and a new Islam is now being generated. Because the empire has now demanded on the menu of this restaurant a jihadification of Islam. We want a jihadi menu, and this is what we need. This is what we need, and we need it now. And there are side benefits, of course, for the owners of the restaurant. There's to produce what these people want, you know. They may be sacrificing Indonesian cuisine in the process. They'll be destroying Indonesian cuisine in the process, but there is the exotica, the attraction of the Occident for this special kind of cuisine on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's also, of course, lots of money to be made from the arms influx, and you take your 10% or your 20% and so on. So the restaurant owner, who is an indigenous Indonesian, is also benefiting from this. So our local oligarchs, our local kings, our local sultans and so on are all in on the deal. And then the Soviet Union is dislodged. The Soviet Union collapses. There is now one sultan and no need for two competing sultans at the moment. And the empire then comes into the world of Islam and now demands another product on the menu. The demands of the empire at the moment is moderate Islam. So the Indonesians as a people are of no consequence to the empire. They're not interested in Indonesian cuisine at all. It is their needs. And there is a veneer of, we're eating in a French restaurant, we're sophisticated. We're eating, you know, where this chef is a Michelin chef, and so there's this veneer about this, and underneath this veneer is brute power and ideology. And so the challenge then is, how do we deal with this continuous invasion of our culture and our cuisine? How do we confront it? And to develop an Islam, an understanding of your cuisine, that in some ways must piss these people off. If you develop a cuisine that consistently suits the appetite of these people, and I'm putting it in a different way from the way I put it at the summer school, if you produce continuously a cuisine that fits the appetite of these people, then you are ultimately producing a cuisine that is, I think, profoundly heretical and anti-prophetic. Because prophets did not come into the world to satisfy the appetites of the powerful. Prophets never came into this world to ask, how do I fit in with the powerful? So when you continuously reshape your cuisine, you produce the moderate Muslim, you produce the peace-loving Muslim, you produce the Muslim that is at ease with modernity, the Muslim that is at ease with socio-economic exploitation and injustice, that has no questions to ask of the arms industry, that doesn't ask, where does your hunger come from? I really think, for the sake of your own health, you know, I'm sorry. There's the one is the integrity of my restaurant, of my cuisine, and the other is, I'm sorry, but a diet may not be bad for you. So I'm not going to produce the kind of food that you are continuously demanding of me. But this is the one challenge that we have. The challenge of the empire that seeks to to own this Islam, mold this Islam, continuously reshape this Islam in terms of its own demands. And we cannot ignore that there are also dynamics inside the restaurant. And the dynamics inside the restaurant is that in the kitchen, there are slave workers inside the kitchen. And that this Indonesian owner has employed these Indonesian guys, but he's got their documents. Or he smuggled them in from Indonesia, and they are without documents. And they live in the netherworld. In Indonesia, I was in Tunis a few days ago, and somebody spoke about some parts of Tunisia as the Manatik al-Dhul, the areas of the shadows. So inside the restaurant is the world of the shadows, the world of another marginalized. So Indonesian cuisine is under attack. But Indonesian cuisine also comprises of real Indonesian people who are working in that kitchen. And they are without papers. They can't surface. If they surface, then the other representatives of these powerful men will seize them. So inside Muslim societies are Muslims who are being marginalized and oppressed by other Muslims. But their own marginalization, their own oppression cannot surface, because if it does surface, it gets weaponized by those powerful people who have got their own reasons for invading the restaurant, but now they have an additional reason. They'll say, oh, we are coming to liberate those workers who are oppressed inside the Muslim society, so we are coming to liberate the Muslim women in the restaurant. We're coming to liberate the gay Muslims. We're coming to liberate the atheist Muslims inside the... So, but at the end of the day, there are these serious problems inside the restaurant also. And you're sitting with a restaurant owner who keeps on telling his folks, but we've got these barbarians at the door. So we've got the Western civilization at the door. They're invading our society. They're going to occupy us. And so you have the ulama, for example, in many Muslim countries, in Saudi Arabia, in several other, who keep on saying, you know, the barbarians are at the door, the barbarians are... And of course, politically, we know that it is true. But this, the barbarians at the door, is used as a weapon to control the workers inside the kitchen. And so... how do we find a balance between acknowledging and fighting the empire at the door, and at the same time not have this being used as a continuous weapon against us? So it is in this context to address the multiple forms of oppression, and I have no doubt what the priority is. There are priorities. I do think that the barbarians at the door requires our far greater urgency. And we can't allow the barbarians at the door to shape the urgencies of Muslims inside. But we need to acknowledge also that there are issues inside Muslim society. And so for me to conclude with is that Muslims outside the global north must acknowledge that they are citizens of the empire. You are citizens of the empire. And as citizens of the empire, regardless of your own positionality inside the empire, whether it is male or black or male or female or whatever, regardless of your own positionality inside the empire, you are also citizens of the empire. And that imposes then the urgency on you to begin to challenge your own civilizations, your own empires. Your priority cannot be those societies out there. The liberation of those societies, yes, but the problematization of your own societies and how your economic structures, your military industrial complexes, your oil industries are in fact responsible for much of either the dysfunctions inside Muslim societies or the difficulties inside Muslim societies of actually addressing all of those. The last point that I want to make, and I'll be very, very brief about this, and it fits in with something that HOURIA had mentioned. You know, in the South African liberation struggle, that is now often kind of lionized like this, and people pretend, you know, that Nelson Mandela went to jail because he organized a series of Sunday school picnics for peace. No, Nelson Mandela was trained in Algeria as a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was trained as a terrorist. Nelson Mandela came back to South Africa having given up on the non-violent struggle and established the armed wing of the African National Congress. Inside that war, there were many innocent people that also died inside that war. But Mandela was lucky to have gotten only a lifetime imprisonment, because in terms of the law, he should have been hanged. Okay. Mandela not only went to jail because he was a terrorist, but at least 10 years before he was released from prison, he was given the option of being liberated or being freed from prison if he renounces violence. And he said that a person that is jailed doesn't have the freedom to announce or renounce, to advocate or to renounce. I will not. So Nelson Mandela refused to renounce violence. It was only when a number of factors inside South Africa, including revolutionary violence and an insurrection inside the country and involving the Cubans and so on, fighting with the South African forces, and a decisive defeat that the Cubans inflicted on the South Africans in Angola, Cueto Carnavale, that one of the factors that led to forcing the white South Africans to the negotiation table. So, but I wanted to just mention one little incident that happened. I was still at school, and I was a part of the Black consciousness movement at that time, part of the liberation struggle and so on. And we went around singing, and it was, I'm not very good with singing, I've never been very good. In fact, in class at school, whenever the class really wanted to have a good fun or laugh, during the music class, they would tell the music teacher, Sir, Farid hasn't done a solo in a long time, you know. And then it was a stupid guy, I mean, Mr. Hendricks, and he would fall for the joke, you know. The class was having him on, and then he says, yes, Farid, you know, you have to do a solo. And Farid's solo, of course, would last for only about 2-3 seconds, and the whole class would burst out in laughter. But this wasn't a solo, but this is how it went. Arson, rape, and bloody murder. Arson, rape, and bloody murder. Arson, rape, and bloody murder when the Black Revolution comes. And this was us. Thousands of us walking around the stadium during the early 1970s. All of us are revolutionaries. This is us. And so this was, yes, this was a part of the anti-apartheid struggle. Now, there was nothing nice about this song. They were ugly. It was ugly, it was violent, it was misogynistic, it was hate-filled. But it was a part of our struggle. At the end of the day, in this particular case, our responses to apartheid was deeply problematic and flawed and misogynistic. But we were not the problem. Our responses to apartheid was deeply problematic. But we weren't the problem. Apartheid was the problem. The occupation of our land was the problem. And so today, and I'll finish on this note, there are many Muslim responses to oppression, to occupation, to invasion that are deeply repulsive, revolting, and disgusting. ISIS being one of them. Very unpleasant. I can't stand it in the same way that now I can't stand that ugly song and what it represents. But at the end of the day, Muslims, regardless of how problematic they are, Muslims are not the problem. The problem is the empire. The problem is the occupation. The problem is the greed of the global north. And it is this fundamental, it is the recognition of this as our primary contradiction, and not the contradiction with Muslim society that drives Islamic liberation theology. Thank you very much.